Welcome to our 18th Annual Center for American Studies Conference on America's Founding Principles and History. This year we're focusing on civil discourse and civil disobedience. My name's Elizabeth Coffer-Bush. Before we get started, I'd just like to take a quick moment of silence for those who were involved in the sad crash last night. Thank you for that. Now to happier matters, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jonathan White. He is a nationwide renowned scholar and award recipient for his Lincoln Scholarship, and now he's moving further into Frederick Douglass Scholarship as well. I'm sure you all know him, but please welcome Dr. White.
Well, thank you, Liz. I'm seeing some of my students from American Studies 100 here. It's good to see you. And for those of you who got up early to make it to a 9:30 session, I might give you double extra credit for doing that. So congratulations. I want to introduce my friend Brian Mitchell. He is an independent scholar specializing in Reconstruction and African American history. His book, Monumental, Oscar Dunn and His Radical Fight in Reconstruction, Louisiana, highlights the life of Louisiana's first Black lieutenant governor. And it's won numerous prizes, including the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award, the Louisiana Literary Award, the American Association for State and Local History's Leadership in History Publication Award, and it's also been recognized by a number of other institutions, including the Organization of American Historians, the National Book Festival at the Library of Congress, and Publishers Weekly. Brian has served as Director of Research and Interpretation at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois, as a Professor of History at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and he serves on the board of the Lincoln Forum Board of Advisors. And in what must have been a tremendously cool experience, he was also the personal guest of Congressman French Hill at a State of the Union address a couple of years ago. I've gotten to know Brian well over the last 3 or 4 years, and I consider myself fortunate to count him among my friends. So please join me in welcoming Brian Mitchell.
I'm glad to see that there are lots and lots of students in the audience. I'm hoping that many of you are history majors. The story of Oscar James Dunn is intimately connected to my own personal story and my own personal history. The little girl on my far right, your far left, is Maddie Jackson Dunn. Maddie Jackson Dunn is my great-grandmother. She was born in 1897. She was the daughter of Robert and Ella Jackson, and my great-great-grandfather, Robert, was the son of a slave, Jane Gerald Jackson. At 19, my grandmother was a teacher. She had gone to normal school, and she'd travel around Louisiana and teach in rural communities. At 19, however, she was married, and you couldn't teach any longer. So she began a family. Now, that was her at maybe 7, 8 years old. This is how I remember my great-grandmother. The story begins almost 50 years ago to the date. And I know this because the story begins in the bicentennial year of 1976. Yes, that's me in the sky blue leisure suit. The story is about my grandmother in oral history. In the African American community, as with most other communities, history is transmitted often in casual conversations over dinner tables and in homes. My grandmother didn't watch television. My grandmother liked to play the piano. She loved to read, but what she loved most was going through scrapbooks and looking at old photograph albums. And that's what I did when I went there. And I went to her house every day after school. She was walking distance from my elementary school. This isn't what the school looks like. This is what it currently looks like. It didn't look that way 50 years ago. The reason this is important to the study of Dunn, and Dunn, this is Oscar James Dunn. He was elected, he's the first man in our nation to be elected a lieutenant governor, first African-American to be elected lieutenant governor. He's also the first African-American to ever serve in a judicial capacity, the first African-American ever to be considered for the vice presidency of the White House. And most people in Louisiana have never heard of him. Never. So I went entirely through school without ever hearing mention of Dunn. The first time I came across Dunn was in my grandmother's scrapbook when I came across this article. And it describes Dunn. He was to them, Black Americans, their great preservative, their leader, the embodiment of their hopes, the real Moses who, as they fainted and famished in the struggle to reach the goal of acknowledged manhood, smote the rock of adversity till it gushed forth the cheering waters of hope. It was Oscar James Dunn who led his people from the land of oppression and bondage. The words that caught my eye as I went through the scrapbook was Dunn's last name. And I realized it was the same last name of my grandmother and my late grandfather. So I began to ask her questions about Dunn. And she began telling me the story of Dunn's life. Being the bicentennial year, we were also studying state and national government at my elementary school. So when the teacher asked if anyone could identify any past lieutenant governors or governors of the state of Louisiana, I boldly lifted up my 7-year-old hand, shook it wildly, and she called on me. And she said, "Okay, Brian, what lieutenant governor or governor do you know about that you like to tell the class about?" And I stood up and I began talking about Oscar James Dunn. And she stared puzzled. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Well, I've never heard of Dunn. This couldn't have ever happened. There's never been an African-American lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana." I replied in a rebellious tone that she was incorrect. There had been 3, and then proceeded to name them: Oscar James Dunn, PBS Pinchback, and Salazar Carpenter Antoine. For disagreeing with the teacher, I was sent to the office. I went home crying, bawling, and I sat on my grandmother's couch with her and told her, "I told them everything you told me about Dunn, and they said he never existed." She said merely that everyone had forgotten him. I went through high school, junior high school, and never heard Dunn's name mentioned again. That was until I took my first African American history class as an undergraduate. This class was taught by historian Raphael Casimir Jr., who very quickly became my mentor. He was the first person who knew anything about Reconstruction, so I could actually sit down and have conversations with him. He'd actually pass on primary sources to me and give me ideas about what I should be reading. Without my grandmother and Raphael Casimir, I probably wouldn't be a historian today. Those two influences of oral history and a trained academic were what drove me to the field. Oscar James Dunn was born a slave in 1822. He was the property of a merchant in the city of New Orleans by the name of George P. Bowers. Bowers owned Oscar and his mother, Mary, and his sister, Jane. Oscar and Jane did not share the same father. Jane's father was a free man that had recently migrated, and when I say recently, he had gotten to the city in 1819. A free man who was a carpenter, and he's a very important carpenter to the city of New Orleans. He comes to the city of New Orleans with a theater impresario by the name of James Henry Caldwell. Caldwell builds the first American theater with the help of James Dunn, and James Dunn prospers alongside this impresario. When he has enough money, he purchases his new family, Jane, Mary, and Oscar. And for the first time, Oscar is free. When you're purchased in Louisiana, you get distinguishing marks alongside your name. FMC, Free Man of Color. And for the first time, he's able to take a last name and a middle name. Before then, Oscar had just been property and known in every record merely as Oscar. But when he decides to take a name, he decides to take the name of the man who freed him, his stepfather, becoming Oscar James Dunn. We know a good deal about his early life, and it's largely because of primary work that was done by me. Unfortunately, there were only 3 papers before I started writing initially the dissertation that would become the book. There were only 3 existing papers on Dunn, and none of them more than 37 pages long. The primary source research took more than a decade. In fact, it took a decade and a half to actually pull together all the records that were found. But one of the ones that I'm most proud of came from the notarial archives in the city of New Orleans. And this was the purchase document for Dunn by his stepfather, where he purchased the family for $800. And 2 years later, according to the law, he was allowed to free them. When he freed his son, for the first time, Dunn could do something that would change his life forever, and that was be educated. Louisiana had strict laws that forbade slaves from being educated, but once a free man, his father began sending him to a black boarding school. At that boarding school, he learned to read and write in both French and English. He loved reading and writing, and he would have liked to stay in school his entire life, but he needed a trade. His father was a skilled artisan and decided at the age of 14 that he should leave the school and begin apprenticing as a plasterer. Dunn hated plastering. Dunn hated plastering. He was apprenticed to 2 different masters, and we know those names largely because of primary sources that were discovered. But at some point, he gets in a disagreement, and he decides to abandon a job before it's completed. This would lead to a reward being put out for him. While Dunn was a plasterer, he began studying music, taking his studies under an Italian guitarist by the name of Torna. And he gets so skilled at this craft that he becomes a teacher himself and begins taking on women in the elite community, both the black and white community, and teaching them how to play the guitar. And he loves this idea of being a teacher. In fact, he does it for several years until a scandal emerges inside of the Afro-Creole community. The scandal happens in 1860 when a black musician by the name of Thomas Martin is discovered to have entered into a sexual liaison with a white student. This sexual liaison that he's entered into is with no other than a white actress's daughter, a woman by the name of Fannie Thayer. Fannie Thayer will go to the police and maintain that Martin has abducted her daughter. And by the time the police go to retrieve the daughter, months have gone by. When the police arrive with Thayer in hand, Martin is there, her daughter is there, and their new child is there. The scandal hits all of the papers in the city. And not only as the scandal begins to develop, Thayer is not the only liaison that Martin has. The paper will publish all of the liaison by their address and their initials, so they are easily identifiable in the census. Martin will be arrested, taken to the county jail, and a huge mob will form outside of the jail. The mob will threaten to tar and feather Martin. However, the sheriffs will not allow them. Dunn decides to abandon the craft of teaching music and return briefly to his job as a plasterer. There are a number of things that influenced Dunn's life. And we've talked about one major influence, and that is education. The second major influence on his life will be the church, and a particular church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. New Orleans has the largest congregation in the Deep South, and this is the church that Dunn attended. It's called St. James AME Church. It sits prominently near Canal Street, so it's about 2.5 blocks away from Canal Street in a section of town called Treme. And Treme is one of the nation's oldest black neighborhoods. Dunn lives only 1.5 blocks from the church. And Dunn serves as one of the deacons in the church. The next major influence in Dunn's life are the Freemasons. Dunn is a Prince Hall Mason. Not only is he a Prince Hall Mason, he will rise to become the Grand Mason of the Grand Lodge. So he's the head of the Masons for the state of Louisiana twice in his life. In that role, and you will see as we go on in this conversation, he is able to create a system, a network, in which he's able to develop voting rolls and create a polling system and begin to register voters through those two institutions. In 1867, Dunn takes his first political role. And Dunn, by this point, is no longer apprentice or plasterer. When the war starts, he abandons those jobs and begins a office helping African Americans find work on plantations. He begins writing contracts for the Freedmen's Bureau as they begin looking for workers on plantations, and this will make him extremely wealthy. By 1867, Philip Sheridan is appointed the general over District 5 of the Reconstruction districts. And he cannot trust the Democratic leaders that were in office. So after removing many of the Democratic leaders, and they removed them in 1866 after the New Orleans Mechanics Hall riot, Dunn is appointed to the Board of Aldermen, making him one of the first African Americans in the South to have a political role. Not only is he appointed to the Board of Aldermen, he also becomes the assistant recorder for the city's 2nd district. And in this capacity, he serves also a judicial role. In his very first case, he will have a client that will refuse to accept his authority in court. Not only does his client refuse to accept his authority as a judge, they will also, the prosecutor in the case will also maintain that the judge, Oscar Dunn, has no authority, and he will hold everyone involved in the case in contempt, making them respect his authority. In 1868, Dunn will reluctantly take the nomination for lieutenant governor of the state. He had to be convinced to take this nomination by no other than Maester Langston, who will walk up and down Canal Street with him for a whole evening, returning to his house in the early morning. Hearing the two men argue on her porch, Oscar Dunn's wife, Ellen Dunn, will emerge from the house and beg her husband to take on the nomination. Oscar Dunn will assume the nomination in July of 1868, being elected and sworn in as the nation's first Black lieutenant governor. It doesn't take very long before Oscar Dunn and the Republican Party are at odds with one another. It just took the Civil Rights Bill, written by the Isabel brothers, two African-American Creoles in the city of New Orleans. This new Civil Rights Bill looks to espouse in state law what federal law had already made manifest. However, when the Civil Rights Bill reaches the desk of then Governor Henry Clay Warmoth, he will veto the bill, causing a schism within the Republican Party of the city and the state. Oscar James Dunn will lead what is called the radical division of the Republicans. And in his leadership, he will come against his very own Republican governor. In 1871, Oscar Dunn will seek to integrate public schools in the city of New Orleans. Returning from the 1870 Christmas holiday, he will admit his own children as the very first students in white schools, the very first African-American students to attend white schools in the city of New Orleans. The girls will be enrolled in the Madison School. And the Madison School, many of the white students will pull out of the Madison School after they are enrolled. Later that year, as Dunn approaches the impeachment trial for Henry Clay Warmoth, Dunn will go to a banquet and mysteriously be ill. And in November of that year, he will succumb to an illness. On the 23rd of November, he will die in his home. His family will refuse an autopsy, leading many to suspect that he was poisoned, and immediately have a funeral on the 24th. The funeral for Oscar Dunn is quite noteworthy in the city. As many as 50,000 residents attended this, making it the largest funeral in New Orleans history. Oscar Days Dunn's funeral was attended by both Democrats and Republicans, and all of the offices of the city were closed for that day. His procession included military groups, fraternal organizations, police, and political organizations, both Republican and Democrat. For those who have been to the city of New Orleans, an idea of how long the procession was is easily obtained. At one end of the French Quarter, the north end of the French Quarter, is Claiborne Avenue. He lived one block north of Claiborne Avenue. A mile south is the river. As the funeral procession left his home, it snaked around the river and returned back to St. Louis Cemetery number 2, where he was buried. So we're talking about a funeral train that's over 1.5 miles long. And there were still people leaving when people were entering the cemetery. The photograph on the right is a commemoration that was held in 2002. And they're putting a laurel next to his grave. There are modern masons at the commemoration, and I was happy to be at that ceremony. When we talk about the impact of Dunn, and this is really what's important, when we talk about the impact of Dunn, we need only look at some of the articles that were written immediately after his funeral. And this comes from the National Era. So I wanted to use an article that had nothing to do with that wasn't published in the city of New Orleans, outside of the city of New Orleans. Gifted with remarkably sound judgment, there was no man in Louisiana whose opinion and counsel upon questions of state were often sought by honest men of both parties. His parliamentary talent has long been the theme of admiration, and for dispatch of business in his official chair, few men in the Union have ever been his equal. Oscar Dunn is important for a number of reasons. And when I point to things that he did during his administration, one of the first things I have to point to is his sterling reputation. Reconstruction, and he's quite the iconoclast when we look at how Reconstruction was taught when I was a young man. I was taught that African-American leaders were ill-prepared, inept for their roles, and that they were corrupt. He was a man of sterling character. He was a man that compromised whenever he could. He was a principled leader, and it has always been my theory that is one of the reasons why he disappears from the historical record. A lot of people ask me when I first began writing about Dunn, if Dunn was so wonderful, why didn't they memorialize him immediately after he died? And I always have to tell them about all the things that Dunn did in his life. And one of the things that Dunn does outside of integrating public schools, having been born in slavery, while he sat on the alderman's board, he begins writing legislation to end apprenticeship programs because he saw them as a scheme to take children and put them back in the fields, using them as slaves had been used. When he realized how many orphans there were and the need for good schools, he donated all of his money to build schools and orphanages. His wife would often hold fundraisers for African American children, and she herself began teaching in these schools. New Orleans has a long history of resistance, and Dunn has a role in this resistance. As protests were happening locally over access to streetcars, where Black soldiers were told that they had to stand or empty out cars to allow white patrons access to them, Dunn decided to bring this to a national forum, deciding to visit Ulysses S. Grant following his inauguration. Dunn will take a train from New Orleans, and that train will go all the way to Washington, D.C., then to Boston, and then to New York City. What's important about this trip is Dunn wants people to know what it's like for African Americans, the struggles that they have. So in every city he goes through, the trek is followed. When Dunn begins his journey, he visits the Great Northern Railroad's president, no other than General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard. And he tells Beauregard that he would like a first-class ticket. Beauregard reminds him that a first-class ticket means that he would be sitting with white men and women. And even though Dunn is allowed to purchase the ticket, Dunn is not allowed to sit in the seat. He has to sit in a black car, which had no sleeping accommodations. And he takes this black car all through Louisiana, all the way to Kentucky. And when he gets out in Kentucky and he tries to board an omnibus, he's told that you can't sit inside of the omnibus, but you can sit atop the omnibus in what was called the Negro's perch. He refuses this, seeing it as an insult, and he hires his own coach to drive him across the river into Ohio. In Ohio, he attends a wedding of one of his close friends, a Louisiana senator. And he makes preparations to go to Washington, D.C., reaching out first to the Willard Hotel. The Willard Hotel sits prominently across the street from the White House. And when he tries to get into the hotel, he's told that he could sign the logbook, but he's not allowed a room. All of these stories are published. When he goes to Washington, D.C., he's invited to come to the floor of the Senate. And he comes to the floor of the Senate, and many of the Republican senators praise him for doing this. However, several senators who are Democratic, particularly the senator from Kentucky, is ashamed of the fact that he has been allowed to be on the floor. When he gets to New York City, he stays at the Metropolitan Hotel, and he buys a first-class room. However, he's told that he cannot stay in this first-class room, even though he's purchased the room. He's allowed to sleep with the waiters, the valets, in the basement of the hotel. He calls on the mayor of the city, who had been previously, Oates, who had previously been a resident of the city of New Orleans. And he asked if he would join him in the afternoon for lunch. Oates will write back in the New York Herald that if Dunn ever contacted him in the personal way again, he would see to it that he would be thrown out of his hotel. Dunn wiped away the illusion of equality in the North, this idea that there was no racism for blacks above the Mason-Dixon line. Dunn was also a leader of several movements in the city. One of them is the Bakery for the People, modeled after socialist communes in Germany. Dunn would develop a model wherein he encouraged freedmen to donate a portion of their earnings to the Bakery for the People so they could collectively buy businesses in the city, establishing wealth, ownership, and an autonomy for the community. However, not understanding these principles, many of the freedmen did not embrace this idea of collective ownership, but instead put their money in the Freedmen's Savings Trust. One of my favorite scholars, I imagine that many people here share a love for W.B. Du Bois, wrote, "With sufficient general agreement and determination among the dominant classes, the truth of history may be utterly distorted and contradicted and changed to any convenient fairy tale that the masters of men wish." Now, I'd like to get back for just a second to something that I'd said before. Why wasn't Dunn memorialized in his lifetime? Immediately following his death, Dunn's family was destitute. Keep in mind what I'd said previously. He donated all of his money, his entire fortune, to helping the African American community of the city of New Orleans. The city and the state would begin raising money for the widow and his children. The monies that they raised would purchase his home, which was still under a mortgage, and other bills were passed to build a befitting tomb for Dunn. Dunn was in a borrowed tomb that belonged to a friend of his named Casenave. This tomb had a state allocation of some $5,000 in 1872. And a memorial fund was dedicated for Dunn in the amount also of $5,000. However, 1872 is an election year in the state of Louisiana. And the election that takes place is a disputed election. That disputed election would see the government split in half The Democrats would maintain that they won the election and would establish a separate government, and the Republicans would maintain that they won the election and establish their own government. So in 1872, there were two lieutenant governors, and there were a whole array of other politicians that were duplicated by the opposing party. In 1873, this matter would come to a head in Grant Parish, when the sheriff, who is a Republican, won the election, would try to take his seat, and former Confederates who were Democrats would not only not allow him to take his seat, but would kill 150 African Americans that were his supporters. By 1874, the city itself would be overrun by former Confederates. Calling itself the Battle of Liberty Place, some 5,000 Confederates would attack the city of New Orleans, overtaking the city for 5 days and establishing themselves as what they believed was the rightful government. In 1876, one of the most contested elections in American history will take place. The Rutherford Hayes-Tilden election. Its outcome would change African American history and our nation's history thereafter. These depictions are after this election. You see a former soldier still wearing his uniform, reaching for the ballot at the bottom of the page. And you'd see the collection of white businessmen represented by the banker, the former Confederate soldier holding a dagger, and across the dagger, I don't know if you can read it, it says, "Lost Cause." And the Irish immigrant holding the cudgel of the vote. Intimidation would rule, and eventually African Americans would lose their ability to vote. All of these things happen in the wake of Dunn's death. And even though historians are asked not to dabble in the counterfactual, we can't but wonder what would have happened had Dunn not died in November of 1871. Could he have reshaped the election of, say, 1872? I'd like to end with us looking at what used to sit most prominently at the foot of Canal Street, the most well-known street in the city of New Orleans, and the site of the Battle of Liberty Place. This monument sat there my entire life until the city's first black mayor came into office. The United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers, but the national election of November 1876 recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state back, our state. Imagine being a child in the city of New Orleans and having to live in the shadow of that sort of monument your entire life. At Colfax, where the Colfax Massacre took place, and we showed that marker just a minute ago, there is a similar marker inside of the cemetery, which heralds the white men who slaughtered the 150 African Americans at the Colfax riot. And in closing, I'd like to talk for just a minute about the removal of those images and the removal of those monuments. And here on the right, you see the removal of what had been until the completion of Stone Mountain in the 1970s, what had been the largest Confederate monument in our nation. And this is a statue to Robert E. Lee in Lee's Circle in New Orleans. And they were all removed under the tenure of Mayor Landrieu of the city. After he had spoken to Wynton Marsalis and Terrence Blanchard, the two musicians, and they told him about their experiences growing up in the city in the shadow of these monuments. And they wondered why there were no monuments which commemorated the lives of slaves or the Reconstruction leaders. So the city decided to rename monuments and streets. And one of the places that they renamed was the park that overlooks Jackson Square. It was initially named after the artillery unit that had defended the city against Farragut's attack, the Washington Battery. And that park has now been renamed in honor of Oscar James Dunn. When I decided to publish about Dunn, I thought it was important that I should send a message to young people, because as a child, I never heard anything about Dunn, and particularly the young children of New Orleans, a city that is overwhelmingly African American. In my lifetime, it was 60 to 70% African American in the city, and none of the children were ever taught about Dunn. So when I decided to do a book, I decided to do a graphic history and make sure that this graphic history reached classrooms. And so I created a foundation, and that foundation makes sure that the legacy and the history of Dunn is taught throughout the nation. Thank you.
We've got time for questions, if any of you have any.
I'm not very familiar with the history and use of monuments to commemorate historical events and historical persons. I'm just wondering if you can talk generally about the role of monuments and the role you think they should play in American society and culture.
This is a huge debate that took place in New Orleans, particularly around the removal of the monuments. And I was able to join in, even though I was living in Arkansas at the time, via a conversation that I had on NPR that accidentally went viral. This conversation was about who controls public space. Imagine growing up, and like I said, I say this from the perspective of an African-American scholar who grew up in the city of New Orleans. Imagine growing up in a city where everywhere you turn, you're confronted with images and reminders that you were enslaved and that slavery was not a bad thing. And yes, when you see PGT Beauregards on a horse in the middle of City Park or at the entrance of City Park, yes, that is a reminder that the Confederacy existed and that it was a good thing. Jefferson Davis's statue is 2 miles away from that one. Robert E. Lee has this prominent statue atop a pillar. He had never visited the city. Public space and commemoration should belong to the people who occupy that space. And one of the huge questions that emerged during the argument, and there were several open houses, there were several open meetings and forums for people to come together. One of the things that really struck me from the beginning was who attended the meetings and who was arguing for the monuments being retained. Most of the people who were arguing for the monuments being maintained and not being removed did not even live in the city. They all lived in the suburbs. So they all left the city. And none of their dollars were going for the maintenance of these. And none of their dollars were tax dollars, yet they felt as though they should be able to tell the people in that city what was important. And most of these, and I always point this out, most of these were erected in a particular period of time for particular political reasons. I've grown up in the South. I lived in the South most of my life. You can go to any small town in the South, go to that town square, and there's a Confederate monument. And that's not by accident. The Daughters of the Confederacy made that possible. They often gave grants to small towns who couldn't afford a monument. They partnered with foundries to build monuments. In fact, if you go places, you'll see duplicate monuments in places of Confederate soldiers. That's because they were mass produced and sent to the South after the 1890s to commemorate these and to remind people that we're returning back to what we had been before the war. These are painful reminders, and they stop progress in the city of New Orleans. When we talk about the Battle of Liberty Place, I don't know if many people here know who David Duke was. And David Duke was the leader of the Klan in the United States for many years, and I lived not a mile away from his home. He would announce whenever he was running for office from in front of, quite often, the Battle of Liberty Place monument. So there'd be these press junkets right there. We can't say that he wasn't trying to send a message when he did that. Ernest Morial, the first Black mayor of the city, decided to remove the monument, first warehousing it, and eventually, after a long court battle, it was decided that he couldn't destroy the monument. So he moved it behind a hotel in a really dark corner of the French Quarter, right? Now these monuments are sitting in warehouses, and they haven't been destroyed. In fact, offers have gone out to Confederate museums around the country. Offers have gone out to the general public. You'd like to have it, it's free. We'd be happy to have you. We'd even help you, ship it there. But very few people have taken these monuments because of the sheer size of them. Many of these monuments are, when we talk about scale, the statue that sat atop that column could barely fit in this room. I know it looks small when the crane's pulling it off, but it is a giant statue of Robert E. Lee, a man who never visited the city of New Orleans. I keep repeating that. A lot of people say, well, Robert E. Lee is very important. We have a street named after him. Why? He's never visited the city of New Orleans. Any other questions?
I'm struck by the timing of Dunn's death and the precarious and federal and state relationship at the time in Louisiana, just before the Colfax Massacre, the Enforcement Act, and the case arising out of Colfax because of the Supreme Court. So I'm wondering about Dunn's relationship, not just to the executive, but to the judiciary, and whether in counterfactual or maybe it lived, is there a scenario where the interpretation of the Enforcement Act in this locale comes out differently, or do you think it's just baked in regardless of who's still in the political relationships?
Well, when I teach classes on this, it's usually I have 15 sessions to really teach about Reconstruction. One of the things I teach is the Cruikshank case and the importance of the Cruikshank case. From the Colfax Massacre comes a case that will go all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's called the Cruikshank case. The Cruikshank case was a huge reversal The men that were killed for defending Grant Parish's city building where the sheriff was supposed to be installed, only 5 men out of the estimated 500 that attacked actually go on trial and actually are sentenced or given court cases. And these cases will go to the Supreme Court. And what will be determined in the ruling by the justices is that it wasn't the role for the federal government to intervene. This was a murder case, they maintained, and murder falls under the state statutes. Well, this sent a very clear message to the Democrats. If you control the courts, then you control the outcomes. And it also sent a very clear message that violence now is on the menu. If we control the courts, we can commit as much violence as we want politically to an end. And that's why you begin to see this escalation. And that's why in 1874, and that ruling comes out right around the time of the Battle of Liberty Place. It's no mistake that 1874, these people know that it's wrong to go attack your city government and take over the state businesses and the state houses. However, they do it anyway. And that was a test run for 1876 presidential election, where the violence escalates. It escalates so much that Congress maintains in Louisiana and in Florida, we can't trust the results of that election at all. The election's too tampered with. There's too much interference, there's too much intimidation, and eventually a compromise will be met out of the House, and that compromise notoriously is known as the Compromise of 1877. How does the Compromise of 1877 reshape our nation? Well, there were a lot of things that were offered up to the Democrats. The first thing that was offered up was the removal of federal troops. The second thing that was offered up is we'll let you do whatever you want to African Americans. You want to treat them bad, you want to strip them of the vote, it's fine with us. We won't say anything. Third thing, remember, Dunn had to go to get to Washington, D.C. Dunn couldn't go from New Orleans to Carolina and then up. He had to go up to Cincinnati and then turn up. So one of the things that the South wants is their own railroad spur. They want east-west railroads. They argue that that's what's given the advantage to the North. So they give them that. They also give them a cabinet post. A man by the name of Key, a Republican from Tennessee, I believe, assumes Postmaster General. And even though I know most of you laugh and you say Postmaster General, what does the post office matter? The post office today is not even the shadow of the post office in 1876. The post office in 1876 was the only federal agency that had more jobs than the Postmaster General was the Secretary of War. Every other agency was small change. So this amount of patronage being thrown to the Democrats, huge. Last but not least, rebuilding the South. People often don't connect all the dots when we start talking about what it takes to rebuild the South, this concept of the New South. We couldn't have the New South without sharecropping, the re-enslavement of African Americans. We could not have the New South without convict leasing. Convict leasing becomes the way that they will rebuild the South at no cost and keep from raising the taxes on the planter class. Often people ask, well, how was the planter class able to get themselves back on their feet? And I'm sure they would love to tell you stories of bootstrapping and hardship, and no, they just didn't tax themselves. They converted blacks back to slavery using sharecropping and using convict leasing, and those systems allowed them to rebuild their wealth. And the South was able to rebuild. Where did this fancy railroad come from? Where did the roads come from? Where did the levees come from? Still, the backs of former slaves. Always position Dunn as a fork in the road, and that fork not taken. I'll say it again. We're often told not to deal with the counterfactual, but the counterfactual in this case is so powerful. It's so enticing to deal with. It's almost this historical what if. What if Dunn had ascended after Warmoth's impeachment? What if Ulysses S. Grant had selected Dunn as a vice presidential candidate in his second term? What would those things have meant for our nation? Dunn's wife doesn't disappear after the war. She becomes more active. In fact, she marries one of his friends, and she begins writing presidents and acting as a voice for African Americans in New Orleans in the wake of his death. She becomes a countess at the Mint in New Orleans. And in one of her letters, immediately following the Tilden Hayes election, she's writing, asking, look, what's going to happen to African Americans? All of these things are disappearing. The rug's being literally pulled from under our feet. How do we reset ourselves? There wasn't a reset. A reset, never happened. You have the Plessy decision, another disastrous Supreme Court decision, follows Cruikshank. And that sends us backwards. It isn't until 54 that we have a reset in the Brown case. And we find ourselves once again, right here again, as we ponder what's going to happen in our nation next.